Thank you, John. And I want to take the opportunity to thank not only John Robke, but Peter Strumman and James Nye, who have served on the Symposium Committee so well, for their contributions. And I certainly want to thank the Student Society, without whose financial support this symposium would not have been possible. This is the third in the series of Centennial Symposia designed to culminate in the centennial year of 1969. The first symposium 2 years ago was on the challenge in the city. Last year, as you recall, on world starvation. The planning has been done by a faculty, administration, student committee, and in planning this, we have had in mind serving students because we have great hopes that these students will serve our world. In this connection, our aims have been twofold. We want to, in part, contribute to the raising up unto the next generation of some experts and leaders who will walk the corridors of power and be familiar with them and will be dealing directly and significantly with the problems and issues of that time. And these men and women who will be functioning in that way will be having as their base of operation, either directly or indirectly, an electorate, you and I. And they'll be having to deal in a democracy with that electorate, so our other aim is, in part at least, to contribute to the formation of an electorate which will pose fewer and fewer irrational political risks to the government leaders who, because of their knowledge and expertise, are well aware of the issues and of steps that ought to be taken, but because of the problems of a democracy, still hesitate to act. Robert Heilbrenner brought this lesson home very forcefully a year ago. Now, we realize that all of our liberal arts education contributes to this, and our aim is to supplement that effort. So the committee has tried to identify some of the particular problems, not those which are peaking right now, most urgent right now, but those which we guess might become even more urgent in the years when you students will have married, established families, started your careers, and are now ever more taking over the reins of running the world. The problems then that will be peaking at in those days of your late 20s and early 30s and 40s. The problems such as the challenge of the city, of world starvation, and this year, man and his values in a three-power world. To the extent that peoples in underdeveloped countries will have any options and can have any freedom to choose, part of their choice as they survey the three powers will be based upon how these three powers view man and his values and how they treat man. Now, to set the stage for this symposium, to provide perspective, to define issues, we've called upon two of the busiest men on this campus, Dr. Chrislock and Dr. Myles Stenshoel. They're so busy that we didn't have the heart to ask any one of them to handle this job alone. And the job is an enormous one. The first talk will be by Dr. Chrislock, Man and Society in the United States, the historic background. And following him, without further introduction on my part, will be an address by Myles Stenshoel on Man and Society in the United States, Problems and Perspectives. We have planned no question and answer period following these presentations. We want you to save your questions and think about them as you listen to the speakers to come. Professor Leo Grulio tomorrow morning, speaking on Man and Values in Changing Soviet Society. And Professor O. Edmund Clubb, one of the great famous China hands, will be speaking tomorrow night on China's great proletarian cultural revolution. So on Thursday we'll have a summation, a discussion, a panel with Dr. Chrislock, Dr. Jensen, Dr. Noonan, in which time questions raised throughout the symposium can be brought forth. So without further statements, I would like now to introduce first my very good friend, Dr. Carl Chrislock, and after his presentation, Dr. Myles Stenshoel.
The Echo story covering the symposium announced that I would attempt to provide an historical background from the American Revolution to the New Deal administration on man's obligations to society and society's obligation to man in the United States. Now, the story failed to add that this assignment had to be carried out in a time span of from 20 to 25 minutes. Now, I'm not being critical of my able young friend under whose byline the story appeared. He did interview me prior to filing the copy, and he did not misrepresent what I told him, what I proposed to do. However, on further reflection, I decided it would be more appropriate to concentrate on the societal values that became explicit and articulate in early 19th century America, and which I think necessarily are the starting point for any discussion of man and his values in contemporary American society. Now, I will be obliged to stick rather closely to this manuscript to stay within the time limit. I'm not particularly anxious to lose Dr. Stenshoel's friendship, and so he has to be given his appropriate time span also. Now, in describing the dominant forces at work in America from colonial days and into the 19th century, Frank Thistlethwaite, a British scholar who has written on the history of the United States, makes this perceptive comment, and I'm quoting, "Americans, responding to westward pulls, not only abolished the whole apparatus of mercantilist and oligarchic control, but disestablished authority in all its institutional forms: church, law, learning, craft, landlord, class, and family. Instead of," continues Thistlethwaite, "authority rested on the isolated individual who, owing no obligation to any wider corporate unity, carried so much of the responsibility for ordering his life. It was recognition of this fact which led de Tocqueville to invent the term individualism to describe the dominant characteristic of the America he visited in the 1930s. Well, so much for Thistlethwaite. Now, American individualism had a number of derivatives and corollaries which, taken as a whole, dominated the nation's societal values throughout the 19th century and into our own. And I'd like to summarize these briefly. First of all, government at best was a regrettable necessity. We have this interesting statement from a Jacksonian political manifesto of 1837, and I'm quoting, "It is under the word government that the subtle danger lurks. Understood as the central, consolidated power managing the various general interests of society, all government is evil. A strong and active democratic government, in the common sense of the term, is an evil differing only in degree from a strong despotism." Now, that was a Democratic Party statement, 1837. Now, to most 19th century Americans, class privilege was as objectionable as big government. The great opportunities for individual self-realization and material enrichment lying open on the North American continent should not, Americans believed, be available, or should Americans believe, be available to everyone, and must not be allowed to slip into the hands of chartered monopolists. The shibboleth, equal rights for all, special privileges for none, is particularly associated with the locofocal wing of Jacksonian democracy, but the general sentiment was certainly part of a national consensus. Now, along with small government and equal rights for all, the 19th century American cherished the simplicity and virtues which he associated with nature: thrift, sobriety, avoidance of debt, self-reliance, and the whole catalog of chaste republican virtues. To conservative Europeans who believed that American-style individualism could only produce chaos and anarchy, he was inclined to reply that nature's self-regulating mechanisms were more reliable regulators of social processes than man-made institutions. Now, this idea, which was a legacy of the 18th century Enlightenment, was not an exclusive American possession, but it has had an extraordinarily persistent influence on the nation's political, social, and economic thought, as I think we all will recognize. Defenders of the 19th century American way of life also had another answer to those who argued the unworkability of American social ideals. The American religious tradition, along with proximity to nature, had produced a race of people who accepted responsibility both for themselves and for society as a whole. Now, indeed, Tocqueville's observations confirmed the existence of a strong sense of community responsibility. In his celebrated work, Democracy in America, the perceptive Frenchman not only emphasized the self-reliance and materialistic drive of individual Americans, but also their strong community consciousness. In one particularly delightful passage, he notes, and I'm quoting, "No sooner do you set foot upon American ground than you are stunned by a kind of tumult. A confused clamor is heard on every side, and 1,000 simultaneous voices demand the satisfaction of social wants. Everything is in motion around you. Here the people of one quarter of a town are met to decide upon the building of a church. There the election of a representative is going on. A little further, the delegates of a district are posting to the town in order to consult some local improvements. Societies are formed which regard drunkenness as the principal cause of the evils of the state and solemnly bind themselves to give an example of temperance. The great political agitation of American legislative bodies is a mere episode of that universal movement which originates in the lowest classes and extends successively to all ranks of society. It is impossible, concludes Tocqueville, to spend more effort in the pursuit of happiness." Now, Tocqueville also found that what we today would call the American value system was powerfully supported by a popular consensus. And this, of course, reduced the need for coercive political authority. Two things, he wrote, are surprising in the United States: the mutability of the greater part of human actions and the singular stability of certain principles. Men are in constant motion. The mind of man appears almost unmoved. Now, although 19th century Americans were staunchly determined to avoid involvement in foreign wars and alliances, they firmly believed that their way of life represented a new start in history, which in time would exert a beneficent influence on all of humanity. The rhetoric of the 1840s frequently predicted the imminent domination by the United States and its ideals of the entire North American continent, from the pole to the tropics, and nearly as often asserted that American ideals would be adopted by humanity at large. As all of us recognize, this notion has had some influence in our own time, with this difference that 20th century Americans perhaps are slightly less flamboyant about it. Now, occasionally, however, a trace of the old exuberance pops up, or at least has done so within the lifetime of many of us. About 20 years ago, Senator Kenneth Wherry of Nebraska immortalized himself by declaring, "With God's help, we will lift Shanghai up and ever up until it is just like Kansas City." Now, the value system that we have been discussing was scarcely articulated before the nation reached what Walter Ostow has called the technological takeoff point, and within a relatively few decades was catapulted from a predominantly agrarian to an overwhelming industrial society. Now, this raises a perplexing question. It is often asked: how could a value system which was essentially rural in origin and orientation continue to serve a complex urban society as long as it did? Now, there are, I would venture to say, several answers to this question. First of all, the value system, in many respects, facilitated industrialization. Most important, it emphasized the obligation of every person to become involved in productive work. It gave status to technological competence and was open to innovation in both shop and field, if not in thought. It is a good guess that if by some miracle the leaders of today's developing nations could suddenly infuse into their people the same acceptance of the work ethic that characterized 19th century America, these leaders would feel that their battle was at least half won. Now, secondly, it has become almost a truism to say that Americans have never had very much regard for philosophical consistency. And this permitted them, or this often has permitted them, to accept measures that are not in strict conformity with the ideological commitment. Jefferson here would be a typical example. In responding to the constitutional difficulties that faced him when he was considering the Louisiana Purchase, he remarked, "We simply cannot turn down a noble bargain for the sake of a metaphysical abstraction." Now, similarly, the tradition established by Alexander Hamilton called for measures that could scarcely be reconciled with laissez-faire economics. Instead, they were sort of a projected welfare state organized for the benefit of a privileged sector of the business community. And much of Hamilton's program was adopted in the 19th century. Now, another example would be the enthusiastic support given by 19th century Americans to the drive for free public education. This meant the assumption of a pretty broad community responsibility. By mid-century, the obligation of the state and or local community to provide such education was widely accepted, though of course it wasn't universally realized. Now, there were a few purists who protested in the name of established individualist values. In 1830, for example, irascible old John Randolph of Roanoke objected to the free school movement in these words. He said, "Look at that ragged fellow staggering from the whiskey shop, and see that slattern who has gone there to reclaim him. Where are their children? Running about ragged, idle, ignorant, fit candidates for the penitentiary. Why is all this so? Ask the man and he will tell you. Oh, the government is undertaken to educate our children for us. It has given us a premium for idleness, and I now spend in liquor what I would otherwise be obliged to save to pay for their schooling." Unquote from Randolph. Well, he was being logical in a sense, but his logic, of course, didn't appeal to most of his fellow countrymen. Now, along with this expedient toleration of departures from established principles, 19th and 20th century Americans developed a number of defense mechanisms that were consciously or unconsciously designed to harmonize the more glaring contradictions between social values and social realities and between conflicting values. Now, George W. Cable, that remarkable veteran of the Confederate Army, whose insights on racism, though they were articulated in the 1880s, still seem fresh and acute, suggested that such a contradiction lay at the root of the South's and the nation's most intractable problem. Why, Cable asked, did this notion that the man of color must always remain an alien stand so unshaken? We may readily recall how under ancient systems he rose often to public station and power. Singularly with us, the trouble lay in a modern principle of liberty. Our southern forefathers, shedding their blood for this principle, yet proposing to continue holding the American black man in slavery, had to anchor their conduct and their laws in the conviction that the man of African tincture was by nature an alien. Unquote from Cable. Now, in addition to ascribing inherent inferiority to groups who, because of exploitation or other reasons, couldn't make it within society, Americans have often responded to the disparities between value and reality and between value and value by postulating the existence of demonic conspiracies against the American way of life. Now, Marvin Myers, a well-known American historian, believes that America in the age of Jackson was caught in a difficult paradox that led to this kind of treatment. On the one hand, the Jacksonians, consciously and enthusiastically, helped clear the way for an urban industrial America. On the other hand, they held to the ideal of a chaste republican order, resisting the seductions of risk and novelty, greed and extravagance, rapid motion and complex dealings. Now, how to harmonize these two incompatibilities became a serious problem that had psychological overtones. Now, Myers, as I read him, suggests that the crusade against the Second Bank of the United States, an institution which the Jacksonians represented as being a conspiratorial monster, plotting against Republican virtue, served in part to allay the anxieties produced by this conflict in Jacksonian goals. Now, time doesn't permit a further elaboration of this intriguing thesis, and I do think, of course, that the bank issue had dimensions going beyond this. But it is possible that Mayer's insight has applicability beyond the Jacksonian period. It is certainly true that 19th and 20th century Americans have believed in an extraordinarily large number of dark conspiracies, engineered by such diverse groups as Wall Street, international bankers, Jews, Catholics, the foreign-born, the National Council of Churches, the advocates of fluoridation, and, of course, leftist socialists and communists. Now, the anxieties responsible for this phenomenon may be more deeply rooted and broadly based than we have suggested. I think they are. But the notion that imbalances in prevailing value systems is a factor in producing them, I think, would perhaps stand up under investigation. Now, unfortunately, the anxieties to which we have just referred have sometimes become entangled with the conduct of American foreign policy. Now, this is not to say that these anxieties are the only force shaping the nation's diplomacy. I wouldn't for one moment say that. But in the early 1850s, it's a rather remarkable fact that apologists for slavery were among the loudest advocates of tangible assistance to the besieged victims of the 1848 European revolutions. And during World War I, Americans defending, let us say, the continuance of child labor in the nation's factories were on the whole more enthusiastic about the crusade to rescue Imperial Germany from Hohenzollern autocracy than those who favored immediate abolition of child labor. Now, we might add that today the correlation between enthusiasm for self-determination in Southeast Asia and concern for racial justice in the United States is not always perfect. Well, now, before leaving the psychological mechanisms which Americans have erected to protect established values against the destructive impact of changing realities, I would like to mention one final line of defense, and that is the American habit of paying ritualistic obeisance to the nation's virtuous past, when men presumably were more concerned about raising corn than scrambling for profits. Now, a prime example of what I mean here would be the widely circulated series of photographs about 40 years ago depicting Calvin Coolidge's rustic origins. Now, Richard Hofstadter has described one of these photographs in the following language. I think I've seen the photograph, maybe some of you have too. The president sits on the edge of a hay rig in a white shirt, collar detached, wearing highly polished black shoes under a fresh pair of overalls. In the background stands his Pierce Arrow, a Secret Service man on the running board, plainly waiting to hurry the president away from his bogus rural labors. Well, so much for the defense mechanisms. Now, during the last third of the 19th century, when the pace of industrialization rapidly accelerated, the gap between chaste Republican values and dominant urban realities became wider than ever. To bridge the chasm, spokesmen for the country's business elite developed a body of social thought that historians are fond of calling the gospel of wealth. Now, one cannot but admire the ingenuity displayed by these theorists, even if the logic is often vulnerable. Ralph Waldo Emerson's self-reliant individual somehow became linked to robber barons of the Jay Gould and Jim Fisk type. And thanks to a constitutional doctrine known as substantive due process, giant corporations became legal persons enjoying the protections of the 14th Amendment to a much more impressive extent than the Negro freedmen, for whose sake the amendment presumably had been added to the Constitution. Now, competition, which Americans always have cherished as the lifeblood of trade, became part of a momentous Darwinian struggle for survival, the outcome of which assuredly would guarantee progress. And the race, of course, would go to the strong. Regrettably, the weak would have to be crushed, but they at least could take some consolation from the contribution that their demise was making to the advancement of humanity. Now, although the gospel of wealth was agreeable to those who made it into the top echelons of America's power structure, its period of dominance was really comparatively weak, or was comparatively brief, I should say. As early as the 1880s, a group of reformers, including journalists, a few clergy, professional third-party politicians, and a few academicians, began calling attention to the emergence of a powerful financial oligarchy whose control over the basic processes of American society threatened equality of opportunity and menaced the democratic political order and perhaps signaled, many of them felt, the end of American individualism. Now, with the coming of the progressive movement after the turn of the century, this reform mood, the reform mood that had been stirred up by these individuals, became dominant really in all levels of American society. Now, progressive critiques of American society, while differing in emphasis, generally affirmed that the main drift of national development could not be squared with such values as equality of opportunity and everything that was associated with it. Now, just how effective the progressives were in reforming American society is a moot question. Certainly, they weakened the sway of laissez-faire, the realm of economic policy. You know, the populist platform of 1892, which might be regarded as sort of a blueprint for the reform movement of the next 2 decades, proclaimed that the powers of government should be expanded as rapidly and as far as the good sense of an intelligent people and the teachings of experience shall justify. Now, President Theodore Roosevelt, with exuberant zest, and Woodrow Wilson, with a little more reluctance, accepted this principle as a kind of a guideline for their domestic policies, and the American people seemingly approved. And of course, the responsibility of government during the 1901 and 17 period was quite significantly expanded. Now, in a more profound sense, however, progressivism, I think, failed to come to grips with the challenge of adapting societal values to 20th century realities. Its spokesman generally proposed the restoration of some lost temple. And one gets the impression that many of them were basically pre-urban and anti-city in outlook. Now, progressive rhetoric often exalted human rights over property rights, but at the close of the progressive era, the sanctity of private property was considerably more secure than, for example, the right of wage earners to engage in effective trade union activity. And ironically, in America's Southland, the structure of segregation was actually completed under the auspices of ostensibly progressive state governments. Now, advanced progressives like Walter Lippmann, who's been around a very long time, and Herbert Croly frequently complained about this individualistic and rural orientation of most of their fellow reformers. And Croly, among others, solemnly pronounced the passing of the age of individualism. Yet even these men who seemed to theoretically accept the mutability of values, were fond of making a primitive golden age, which presumably had fixed values, as their basic point of reference. Now herein, as David Noble has so ably pointed out, lies one of the paradoxes of progressive thought. Now, the reforms of Franklin Roosevelt's first two terms went substantially beyond those of the progressive era. But whether the New Deal period marked a fundamental transformation of American social values, I think is extremely debatable. By 1939, it is true, a laissez-faire lay in shambles, and the impact of World War II pushed this venerable doctrine further into the background. The basic structure of the American welfare state had also been erected, and this, of course, had vast implications for the obligations of the community to the individual. And government played a more pervasive role as manager of the economy than ever before. And thanks to the Wagner Act and the CIO, a trade union membership had multiplied several times over. Union leaders who a few years before had suffered pariah reputations in many American communities now found themselves invited to serve on Red Cross action committees and even on college and university boards of regents. And ethnic groups, particularly those of Southeast and East European origin, moved from the periphery to the mainstream of American life to a considerable extent. So we then have this. Now, on the other hand, many traditional societal values certainly remain fixed, and remain fixed to this day. Recipients of welfare payments under such programs as aid to dependent children continued to find that acceptance of these payments involved a heavy sacrifice of human dignity, and the notion that involvement in productive work, with productivity rather literally defined, is the only legitimate means of self-fulfillment, still commands wide acceptance today. And beneficiaries of the societal and ethnic, so-called social and ethnic revolution of the New Deal years soon became indistinguishable from old stock middle-class Americans, and equally, if not more resistant, to non-white demands for racial justice. And in 1966, the most populous state in the Union elected a governor who, if his rhetoric is to be believed, is firmly committed to the value system of Andrew Jackson's day. And we're told that it's possible that this man may be our next president. Now, Tocqueville, then, it seems, was right when he noted 136 years ago or so, when once an opinion has spread over the country, that is, over the United States, and struck root there, it would seem that no power on earth is strong enough to eradicate it. General principles in religion, philosophy, morality, and even politics do not vary, or at least are only modified by a hidden and almost imperceptible process. Even the grossest prejudices are obliterated with incredible slowness amidst the continual friction of men and things. And on that cheerful note, I yield the floor to Dr. Stenshoel.
I decided I better get up while you were still clapping for Carl. I'm going to ask you to stand up and pretend that you have a 10-minute break and sit right down again. Would you do that? That's enough. Well, let me begin by revealing a basic bias, or if you prefer, an article of faith. It is this, that nothing in the American political picture ever turns out quite as good as the evangelists of the particular panacea expect, and nothing ends up quite as bad as the doomsayers and Jeremiahs of the occasion predict. I suspect it would not be proper to classify Dr. Chrislock's presentation as a Jeremiad, but if this be optimism, then save us from the pessimists. I should let you in on a secret. In fact, Professor Chrislock is, I think, relying upon me to provide some kind of an exit from this rather uncomfortable bind in which he has placed us. I'm far from certain that I shall be able to do that, to provide that exit, but this I know, that my most esteemed colleague would be the last to give up utterly on the American people, however slow-witted and inconsistent we may be. Well, we had another picture a week ago when Mr. Robert Theobald, British socioeconomist, was a guest on our campus. Speaking at a luncheon, this distinguished visitor suggested that the United States is in a process of dissolution, that we are clearly headed, by way of a police state, toward imminent extinction. Near the end of the luncheon, however, when he was a little better fed, he was able to conjure up a vision of a far better future, involving a society of self-actualizing individuals who, by definition, do unto other self-actualizers as they would that other self-actualizers do unto them. I, of course, am spoofing just a little bit here. I don't think it would be totally unfair to Mr. Theobald to suggest that he was using the old homiletical approach of enticing people into bliss by a vivid representation of, shall we say, an unpalatable alternative. In any event, Theobald is essentially an optimist, not only about the survival of man, but about the possibility of truly human development. American values today, in the context of the current role of the United States in our three-powered world, give less than total support to either the optimists or the pessimists. They continue rather, I think, to reveal contradictions and cross-currents, and shall we say, the confusion which have always characterized American commitments. I should like, before I finish, to look with you very briefly at some of the problems and some of the prospects or even promises which seem to me to be associated with the contemporary pattern of American values. First, however, it might be worth our while to make explicit an assumption which permeates the entire symposium. It is this assumption that values and power are significantly related to each other. The question remains how? How are human values related to the kind of power about which we're here concerned? What does political power, for that is the power we're talking about, what does political power have to do with human values? And the answer to this is not a foregone conclusion. One may say cynically that might makes right, or less dogmatically, but no less arrogantly, that might makes right irrelevant. In one way or the other, so the argument goes, values are determined by political realities in a cause-effect relationship. Or with a Marxian twist, one may argue that, at least in our present epoch, values are a part of the superstructure of our society, at best instruments of power and subservient to power. But the understanding which makes sense to me, and a second assumption I should like to make explicit this morning, is this: that the power-value relationship is not a one-way street, but rather a very complex interaction in which values condition politics as well as the other way around. power does indeed have an impact upon our values, whether for good or ill. In the face of the assertion, for example, that you can't legislate morality, we have often done just that, both for good and for ill. We have legislated, we have administered, we have adjudicated patterns of behavior which in time have informed our sense of morality as well as our sense of legality. But perhaps the more important truth, at least for our present purposes, is this: that morality can and does legislate. Or expressed a little less parochially, power is neither self-subsisting nor self-directing. The values which peoples and nations hold also condition the ways in which they exercise their power. In brief, then, values are themselves a part of the political mix. And I'm going to be very careful here not to say how large a part. That would be a difficult question, but they are a part of the political mix. And depending upon the particular values which we happen to hold, this assertion may or may not be very reassuring. But reassuring or not, it is this assumption that values are important politically, which gives meaning, it seems to me, to our discussions of this week. Now, of course, in saying this, we are expressing a value of our own heritage and of our own society. We believe that we can, within limits, create our own destiny. We are optimistic enough about human nature to believe that change can be progress, and we are pessimistic enough to know that it often is not. But if values do condition power, and if values can be modified, and we're not very optimistic about that after Dr. Chrislock's address, but if they can be modified, herein lies possibility. Herein lies choice. And then choice is not, finally, totally imposed from without by some kind of fatalistic or tragic necessity. Choice can be made by men. What I am saying is, I suppose, not altogether different from what Eartha Kitt said more earthily to Lady Bird the other day, that we can and should choose our goals, choose our priorities, that values at home should not and need not be trampled upon by the assumed necessities of political power. But I'm saying something more, that in the long run, and perhaps also in our present short run, when the long run seems dangerously close to running out, that in the long run political power cannot successfully maintain itself in a society apart from a concern for values as well as for power. The values are an ingredient, and a basic ingredient. Now, lest I be misunderstood at this point, let me make it plain three things that I am not saying. I am not calling for a simple appeal to morality in foreign policy. I am quite happy with the rubric of national interest. Indeed, I insist upon it. But I also insist that the national interest cannot be defined without reference to and concern for the values which hold a society together. It cannot profit a nation to gain the whole world if in doing so it falls apart at the seams. Second, I do not this morning intend to prove or to demonstrate the power-value relationship about which we've been speaking. It remains simply an assumption, and it is expressed simply to suggest the context of this week's discussion of social values. Finally, I do not mean to imply that politics is the only, let alone the best, context for the discussion of human values. We might very well do it philosophically and theologically. We're not doing it that way very much. The political context just happens to be the context which has been assigned to us. But it is a tremendously important one. Well, let's try to get on with the assignment. looking at some of the problems and prospects associated with the values held by Americans. The overarching problem is, of course, that of maintaining or perhaps of achieving what we might call somewhat modestly a viable society. Possibly I should have been less modest had not the term great society been preempted and drained of all utility. By definition, a viable society is one with staying power. And by implication, it rests upon a broadly held consensus. Now, here's another word, consensus, that has been bloodied a bit by political usage, but it's too good a word to give up. I'm not going to let it lie dormant, so I'm going to ask you to join me as I attempt to slough off any latter-day connotations of arm twisting and engineering of consent, which may have affixed themselves to the term. There are, it would appear, at least two levels of consensus which are basic to a viable society. First, the viable society requires a procedural consensus. Whatever the differences which exist as to programs and goals, there is in a viable society a common and basic acceptance of the means, of the socio-political means for resolving, or at least for mitigating these differences. Perhaps this is as good a place as any to dispose of one apparent problem, the problem of government by consent. If government by consent of the governed is to have any kind of reality, it can hardly be construed as consent to any and all governmental activities. So far as I can remember, I have never consented to the Minnesota sales tax, to escalation in Vietnam, or to the draft laws. Nobody even asked me. What I have consented to, I think, is the means by which I can express my disagreement with a given law or a given program. I consent, if I consent, to the socio-political processes for remedying what I consider to be defects. This, then, is the first level of consensus, procedural in character. It is concerned with courts and congresses and city councils, with political parties and presidents, and it relates to their accessibility, to their responsibility, to their responsiveness, and to their concern. Now, it's a tremendously important kind of consensus, and one which is not easily achieved, and it is crucial, it seems to me, over the long haul, to a viable society. But there is a second level of consensus, even more basic and even more crucial. Because a viable society depends ultimately upon a general agreement about the really human dimensions of political life on this planet, about the desirability of political liberty, about the value of human life, about, at least in some sense, the purposes of government, and also about the existence of limits to governmental legitimacy. Without a rather general agreement on this level, without a rather substantial unity concerning the meaning of man in society, the odds against a viable society seem to be pretty great. So we must ask ourselves, how viable is society in the United States in these terms today? It is my argument, or at least my assertion, that our contemporary national malaise, while real and painful and distressing, is primarily associated with the problem of procedural consensus and much less with the more fundamental consensus of basic values. Now, I realize that this may be small comfort, given the need I have asserted for both kinds of consensus. It may sound suspiciously like the medical bulletin which says that the heart is functioning well, it's just the gallbladder and kidneys and liver that are giving us some problems. Or it may be like the assurances of the classical economists who, acknowledging the short-term dislocations and frictional unemployment, insisted that nevertheless, in the long run, things were working out well, with full employment and a self-regulating economy as the end result. The trouble with that, of course, is, as Keynes pointed out, that people live and die in the short run. Nevertheless, if this diagnosis, or this impression, if you will, of our crisis of values is correct, there is hope that with luck we shall survive. More affirmatively, if we survive. It seems to me that when the fever has run its course, we may very well end up, as the saying goes, in better shape than ever. You see what an optimist I really am. To judge from the sound and fury, there are quite a number of Americans who, for one reason or another, say that they want to opt out. You're pretty well acquainted with them. I'm going to move here fairly fast. There are the extremists of the left, the so-called new left, who, though they vary considerably among themselves, seem to be unanimous in condemning the liberal establishment. It is too slow, it is too inept, it is too kept, it is too ineffective. For my part, I find it a little bit hard to know what to make of the new left. Some seem to want a new politics or a new groundswell from the grassroots. There seems to be a little naivete at this particular point. Others seem to believe that politics is useless, and the counsel of such persons comes very close, it seems to me, to anarchism. But whatever their hopes, whatever their goals, for the time at least, they seem to be outside the political system. They seem to constitute, they do constitute a problem as they inveigh against the consensus that a great many of us are members of. Another group alluded to in Dr. Chrislock's presentation is the group which we can perhaps classify as extremists of the right. And they are in many ways very similar to the extremists of the left. They too are a varied group, persuaded that political and social machinery in the United States is saturated with communist and socialist influence. They are today's chief descendants of those in earlier ages who explained what was to them unthinkable by the simple and apparently satisfying expedient of conspiracy. Impeach Earl Warren, I guess that has sort of let up now. Quit protecting criminals, quit promoting communists, which of course the Supreme Court does. Abandon mental health programs since they are simply fronts for a massive brainwashing operation. Not all are activists, of course. Some, seeing no hope at all, simply sit on their hands and bemoan the loss of all that was, for all that was good and true and beautiful, and all that is contaminated. But some are not so passive. They organize militarily to be their own private army when the inevitable communist takeover begins to take over openly. Well, these people, too, to a large extent, are outside the system, outside the procedural consensus, and something of a thorn in the flesh of the body politic. There are, third, of course, the hippies, about whom much has been said and about whom I do not want to say very much, but they too are outside the system. They reject our consensus and they form their own. But there is something curious here, as we've been told a number of times by careful observers, and it is that a good many of the hippies are not so much rejecting our values as they are rejecting our failure to live consistently with our values. Fourth, there are the card burners, the Spocks, the Coffins, the sailors who seek asylum in Sweden. Here are those who have encountered a single issue of such overwhelming importance that whatever the judgments concerning other social issues, they stand their ground on this one. These too are outside the system, at least temporarily. But like the hippies, who some of them are, there is not, in fact, a rejection of the values shared by many of the rest of us. Have you ever thought of these objectors as expressing by their deeds what we have asserted in our Pledge of Allegiance? say that we are a nation under God? Whatever the state's authority, they are saying, whatever the state's authority, it is not yet the authority of God, rather it is under Him. Now, I don't happen to like that in the pledge. Somehow I like it better this way, and perhaps I'm rather inconsistent at this point, but what I'm pointing out is that they are rather consistent with a value which is pretty generally held in our society. They do not repudiate the basic consensus, but they mean intensely and courageously what the rest of us say that we mean. Finally, and perhaps most seriously, there are those who opt out of the consensus because the civil rights revolution has been too little or too late. Now, to our WASP mentality, black power repudiation of the political process seems very depressing and seems also, I suppose, very ironic. From our insular viewpoint, it looked as if Negroes had everything to gain within the processes supported by consensus. Now, at long last, the voting rights promised by the 15th Amendment years ago were finally receiving some substance, and there was progress. It was continuing. Now, finally, whites were beginning to see that the Negro problem was in large part a white problem. That had become a commonplace. Now, for the first time, the 14th Amendment was beginning to be used for the purposes for which it was ostensibly written. Now the filibuster had been broken. Now the politicians were beginning to respond to the Negro vote even in the South. Now, in a word, there was opportunity. But that was from our point of view, and we were probably wrong. But we could not help being depressed and disheartened not only by the violence of our cities, but by the repression and violence used in quelling violence and still being advocated. Here indeed is a painful breach, a bad sore, a breach from our point of view of a consensus that never really was, but that we like to think might have been. Well, I'm not suggesting that these are minimal things at all. They are quite important. But so much for the breaches of consensus. Where can one look for the strengths? I told Dr. Chrislock that he could have all of the time because I had something I could compress, and I may have to do some compressing right now. As we have time, let me mention a few. It seems to me there has been a gross failure of the demonic and the conspiratorial interpretations of society to capture more than a relative handful of adherents. Now, we can find examples, but there aren't really very many. Now, we've had our stomach full in the days of Joe McCarthy, but it seems to me that we are along the path, and an upward path since that time. Another thing, Americans, except for isolated instances, have finally made peace, it seems to me, with positive government. Now, it is true that it wasn't long since the governor of South Dakota was elected as an opponent of the massive bureaucracy at the state capitol in Pierre. But it is also true that Carl Mundt is reelected to the Senate on the strength of the federal spending in the state of South Dakota. It is true that Ronald Reagan was elected governor a short time ago, governor of our most populous state. But it is also true that he has presided without apoplexy, apparently, over the largest state budgets in history. Again, it was after the threat and pain of black power that Carl Stokes has taken the headlines from Stokely Carmichael. Well, that says something. What it says is I'm not going to go through those examples, but I'm not going to leave here, or let you leave here if I can keep you here, without putting in my 2 cents worth of Tocqueville. I would say that much of the change that has taken place was not due particularly, say, to the New Deal. But much of the change that is taking place, I think, is attributable directly and indirectly to the courts and to the Supreme Court, which is not only a political philosopher for this nation, but also a politician philosopher. Here's what Tocqueville said at the same time he said those other things. He said, "Scarcely any political question arises in the United States that is not resolved sooner or later into a judicial question. Hence, all parties are obliged to borrow in their daily controversies the ideas and even the language peculiar to judicial proceedings. The language of law thus becomes in some measure a common tongue. The spirit of the law, which is produced in the schools and courts of justice, gradually penetrates beyond their walls into the bosom of society, where it descends to the lowest classes, so that at last the whole people contract the habits and the tastes of the judicial magistrate. In our day, that means the judicial taste of a Warren court, which is not hung up in exactly the same way that its predecessors were."
Thank you, Dr. Chrislock and Dr. Stenshoel, for starting this symposium in such a grand way. The symposium stands in recess until tomorrow morning at this time here, 9:30, for the address by Dr. Leo Grulio. Thank you.